Hi everyone, and welcome back to Octopus Builds, where we are building out the Trident project for the fictional company Octo Pet Shop. My name is Bob Walker, and I'm the Technical Director of Customer Success, and I am here to talk to you a little bit about multi-tenancy today. So over the past couple of episodes, we've been talking about rollbacks, but I think it's time to move on a little bit because it's time to start talking a little bit about what our fictional company, Octo Pet Shop, actually does. So, Octo Pet Shop sells pet goods at various retail locations throughout the United States. And one of the things that they really wanted to do with the Trident project is have the capability to deploy it in store. So each of their stores, they have a number of different technology IT assets located there. So there's servers, in addition to cash registers, as well as some computers, desktop computers used by various staff throughout the day. So we want to be able to deploy this application to various stores. And up until this point, it's been kind of very hush-hush, this type of project. But now it's time to start pushing this out to some of the pilot stores that are a little bit more adventurous, I guess. So if you're not familiar with like the retail branding and how all that works, don't worry. This is going to be fairly applicable for most types of multi-tenancy use cases. I just picked retail locations because it seemed to work out pretty well in this particular example. And so let's jump in and let's start configuring a couple of tenants. But before we do that, I want to come into my projects. Now you might have noticed that the UI has changed ever so slightly. I am using a cloud instance. I am on the staff ring, and so oftentimes you're going to see things in the UI that has not been released to your particular instance. So think of this as getting a sneak preview. So one thing I want to do, is I want to, why can I not see it yet? I think I went to the wrong spot and I came back. Yes. Project group enabled. I am going to enable tenants. I'm just going to go in and just start hacking away at things. All right, so let's add my first tenant. I think how it works within Octopus Deploy is we don't like showing you settings unless it's absolutely there. So let's just go ahead and start adding a couple of tenants, and we will get into the nuts and bolts in just a second. I haven't had to add a new tenant to a project in quite some time, so this is, sometimes I still forget. It's just how the world works. Now let's talk a little bit about some naming strategy. So I live in the city of Omaha. There's no big secret in that. And if you're familiar with how cities work, at least in the United States, is that oftentimes a city, such as Omaha, is made up of many, many, many neighborhoods that's what constitutes the city. And oftentimes retail locations are named after a neighborhood, a known neighborhood. Maybe it's a annexed city. For example, Millard, as we can see down here, used to be its own town before it was completely annexed by the city of Omaha. Same thing with West Omaha, the Exarban, Elmwood Park area. That was another former area that was completely isolated. So as Omaha has grown, it's annexed additional places. But again, the reason why I'm telling you this is not for a history of Omaha or how to pronounce Exarban, which is Nebraska spelled backwards, in case you're wondering. It is kind of to explain how we are going to name our tenants. Because we definitely want to have a naming convention, and we want to follow the naming convention that's established already by, say, corporation or whatever the case may be. So I'm going to call my first tenant NE for Nebraska. I'm going to call NE01, and I'm going to call it Exarban because I can, which again, it's Nebraska spelled backwards. Go ahead and hit save. So now I've created my first tenant. Now I want to do a couple of things. I'm going to go ahead and connect a project to it, and I'm connect Trident. Now it's going to get upset and said, hey, you must have tenanted deployments enabled. And that's actually a good thing. It's asking you this. That way you don't accidentally attach something to a project that you shouldn't. But I'm going to go ahead and enable tenanted deployments, and I am going to enable this for staging and production. Basically my release channel. Because again, if we go back to the project itself, we'll note that development and QA, they're on their own separate channel. Now, a couple of things have changed, but first, before doing that, development and QA is using the inherited project channel, and the release is using the hotfix channel. So, but it is kind of important to note a couple of things have changed since I made this one small tweak. The project overview screen has changed right now, and now we're seeing untenanted as well as the name of the tenant. We can group by channel, which you can see right here, which now we can see that development and QA does not support it, but I can deploy to staging and production. In addition, I can select a version number, and we can see that this version number was for the release channel, and I can deploy this to staging. I can't deploy this to production for any Exarban 01, and I'll show you what it will look like because I'm going to add in a couple more tenants that don't have staging. So I'm going to show you a couple other things. So let's go ahead and let's build out a couple more tenants. So I have NE01, so I'm going to do NE02 Millard or 02. Connect the project. And this one I'm only going to do production. And I'm going to add one more tenant. I'm going to call NE03 for Benson. Again, I'm going to connect the project. Call production. And finally, I want to add one more tenant, and this is going to be my internal testing tenant. This is fairly common, and this is a recommended practice that I'm just going to call internal. This is something that I recommend anyone who's using the multi-tenancy feature of Octopus deploy. Because again, you want to know how things are going to work. And I'm going to have this go to dev, QA, staging, and production, basically all the environments. Because I want to be able to test this internal tenant and make sure that everything is connected correctly, everything is working as you expect it to work. And you want to deploy the exact same way whenever possible. Now we can't deploy to the actual tenants or the actual stores, but we can mimic it as much as possible. Okay. So let's take a look at what this looks like now. Now, a couple things that are rather interesting. You'll note that I can't deploy to development or QA because it hasn't been assigned to this. But if I set the appropriate filter, I can go directly to production for Millard and Benson. And let's take a look at what that looks like. So I think this is rather interesting. So I have to go to staging for internal and Exarban, but I don't need to do it for Millard or Benson. And the reason behind that is because this release has satisfied the channel requirements, which is something must go to at least one tenant. In this case, it's an untenanted deployment into staging. So this is something just to make note of. This is actually one of the reasons why I don't recommend having untenanted deployments, because you can kind of mess around with the rules and kind of cheese the system, I guess. So let's do a couple other things while we're in here. The first thing I want to do is I do want to come into my general tasks, and I want to, this was the setting I was looking for earlier, because I didn't have any tenants, I didn't have any of that. So I am going to require a tenant for all deployments as opposed to no tenants. And so if we come back here, we still see untenanted deployments, but that's just a holdover from these previous releases. As time goes on, as I create new releases and things get cleaned up, these releases will naturally disappear. A couple other things we need to do. So one of the powers of multi-tenancy is I can deploy to multiple things in the same environment. In my case, multiple retail stores. So I have the internal and Exarban for staging, and then Millard and Benson for production. However, we need to take a bit of a step back, and we need to start thinking about, okay, what does the structure of an application look like? What do the targets look like? How is this going to work? So a few things that we want to do. First up, let's go ahead and let's create a couple more deployment targets. So I'm just going to create a staging deployment target using Cloud Region. I'll call this S tenant 01. This is for my staging. Trident web. I guess the worker pool as is. Actually, you know what? I'm going to do hosted Windows just because. And I'm going to include this in tenanted deployments. And I'm going to select both internal as well as Exarban. I'm going to go ahead and add another. And so what we're doing here is, I'm just going to call this P tenant 01. Production. So what I'm doing inside of here is, this is how you would go through and you would register targets for deployments. And so what I'm doing inside here, because you have to assign a target to a particular tenant. Now, most users are not going to do something this crazy. You would probably very rarely use the same deployment target unless you are doing something like racking and stacking everything in a single web farm or something along those lines. And so let's pretend that we're kind of doing that. But in a real world, we probably aren't doing something like that. But for simplicity's sake, P tenant 02. We're just going to go ahead and do that. Go ahead and add my roles. And finally, let's go ahead and include only in tenanted deployments. So let's just select all the tenants again. Now, this is something that would be automated out. You wouldn't be coming through and clicking through all these different things. There's a series of automation scripts that are provided in the documentation on how to register these tenants. You don't have to go through and click through like 1,000 times or something like that. Alrighty. Now we want to do a couple other things. So we have the targets registered. So let's take a look at what it would look like when we want to go to production. So in the past, when we wanted to go to production, and we're targeting a particular role, we would think that it would grab these servers. So in the past, it would grab all 4 of these servers. However, with tenanted deployments, you have to specify a tenant. So in this particular case, when I want to deploy to internal, it's only going to pick up tenant 1 and tenant 2. And so if you had a series of different machines, all with different tenants, this is how you would isolate out machines. It's because you have this kind of now you have this third dimension. You have the environment, you have the role, and then you have the tenant. And that's what Octopus Deploy is going to be filtering down. All right, so we have the infrastructure built out. Now the next thing to worry about is the database. And now, as you know, we've been kind of pseudo using the same database server for everything, and we're going to continue to do that. But we need to come up with a good naming convention on something like this. Because right now, our database name is Project.Database.Name, and we're just doing Trident, or we're doing Trident _ Octopus environment name. And this is where it's a good idea to come up with a naming convention on something like this. And what I recommend folks do is come up with a naming convention that can be hopefully applied to as many environments and as many tenants as possible, because it's going to make things relatively simple to do and manage on something like that. So let's go ahead and come up with something like that, because that's what we're going to want to do for this particular example. To do that, I am going to create a new variable set, and I'm going to call this retail location. And the reason I'm creating a new variable set, library variable set, is because I want to have a place where I can house some of these common items or common variables that we would have that would apply to any sort of retail locations that are out there. To store. So if I were to create multiple projects and they were going to use the same series of tenants because they're all going to retail locations, they would then hook into this. Now, up until this point, we pretty much stayed on this tab, this variables tab. There's another tab called variable templates. And with variable templates, what we're going to do is we're going to say tenant, actually I'm going to call this retail.tenant.short name. Tenant short name. Let's actually put some spaces in there. The short name of the tenant. And I'm going to say I'm going to make this a single line text box, and I'm not going to give it a default value. Okay, so this variable template, it's going to stay with me for just a second. So this variable template is assigned to this variable set called retail location. I'm going to come into my project, and I'm going to add that library variable set. So a variable template is something that you have to specify, and it's used by tenants. So let's come back over to tenants, and what we're going to see is now we have 4 exclamation points saying that, hey, this isn't, you need to set these variables. So I'm going to come in here, and there's an option called project variables and common variables. By default, it goes to project variables. But because I have set a library variable set, these are known as common variables. So this is something that's going to apply to all the environments across this particular tenant. So this one is just going to call, I'm just going to call int. And then I'm going to go over to tenants, and I'm just going to do the same. I'm just going to repeat the same thing each time. Now, I could have come up with a kind of variable replacement using some filters and everything like that. That works. The only downside of that is I'm not a super big fan. I want to change something that's bugging me now. I want to add these to staging. I don't know why, just cause. I could come up with something that's some sort of naming convention to make it even more robust. I like doing this just because it's very kind of in your face, like, hey, I need to set something like this. But as time goes on, you might come up with a kind of notice that, hey, this is kind of a convention that I already have. Like I could just give me the first 4 characters or something like that of the name, or give me every character up to a space, or until the end of the name. So you might have some sort of convention that you come up with that way. This is just something that's simple to kind of get you going. So I have those common templates, retail.tenant.shortName, and so I'm just going to copy this in here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my variables. And so this is just going to be, and so what I've done here is I don't have to go in and have to reset like a whole bunch of things. I'm only making a few small tweaks to my deployment process. I'm not changing anything in my deployment process. And that's one of the powerful things about multi-tenancy. I'm still going to be using the same deployment process that I've been using, my rollbacks deployment process, which I should probably check in. I'm still using the same deployment process. I'm making a few small tweaks here and there, but generally I can reuse everything to almost an unlimited number of tenants. And that's really the power of Octopus Deploy. What you're seeing here is that I define this process once and it's going to be used across everything. So let's go ahead and let's create a release, because we want to get a fresh version of the variables, and we want to make sure that everything is working good. Before we do that, I just remembered I had ServiceNow integration enabled. So I'm just going to go ahead and disable this. As much as I want to do ServiceNow integration during this particular demonstration, let's just go ahead and just turn this off for right now. All right, so let's go ahead and create a release, and let's call this 2.0.0 for now. I'm going to be going to, let's just go to the default 2.0.0, because I want to deploy to the dev and test environments for right now. So a couple of things are going to change that you're going to notice. So since I turned on you have to have a tenant, it's now going to require that going forward. So now I have internal, I have to select a tenant. I cannot have a deployment without a tenant. It goes, you have to select a tenant. So go ahead and click on deploy. Now everything's going to work pretty much the exact same as it always has. And that's one of the powers of multi-tenancy as well. As I'm seeing the exact same processes I've seen before. Now one of the interesting things is this calculate deployment mode might get a little confused once I start doing multiple tenants. And so I might have to come in here and actually make a change to this step template as we're going through here. So this is rather interesting as I'm talking through this and thinking about this out loud. But the idea is, again, you're kind of seeing what this is going to look like going forward in the future. Now, the other thing that was interesting is I'm very curious about this. So I don't recall changing this. It might get confused. I'm very curious as to what the database name it created. We're going to find out because I did not tell the runbook to be multi-tenantized. So we're going to see what that looks like in just a second. I have a feeling this is going to fail because I didn't tell the runbook to go ahead and be multi-tenantized. I might have been lucky and it's just picked everything up as I expected it to, but we're going to find out together. So that's one of the things to kind of make note of, is that once you enable multi-tenancy, it's kind of one of those things that's pervasive. You have to change the project. You're going to have to change any runbooks, because you can have runbooks that are not tenantized in a multi-tenantized project. So let's take a look what that looks like really quick. Boop, boop. Haha, so see, it's untenanted. So it did that deployment to development untenanted. So I need to make this multi-tenant, and it must be run against a tenant. I'm going to go ahead and save that, and I need to make a change to my deployment process. And so one of the nice things is I can just use the system variable that's already provided, and it will figure it out for me. All right. But everything else should work exactly how I expect it to work. So let's go ahead and let's say making the runbook multi-tenant. Cool. If that passed, I'm going to be... Yeah, it failed. Failed big time. Yeah, not surprised because it couldn't find the database. Cannot open database because it doesn't exist. Because I didn't create it. Because I forgot to tell the runbook to do it. See? This is what I was expecting to have happen. So I'm just going to go ahead and fail the deployment. I'm going to create a new release, and we're going to go from there. Okay. So let's create a new one. 201 default happy days. So while we're waiting for this to run, I want to talk a little bit through about some common use cases behind multi-tenancy and why it was created. So this is one example. So these are retail locations. Another example might be you have different data centers. So if you're using, say, different cloud regions, for example, in AWS, you might use the East US 2 cloud region, West US cloud region, and the West US 2 cloud region. And you want to have the ability to control when you deploy to each particular region. Maybe you have a series of rules in place where you say, hey, we want to go to West US 2 first and then the other ones after that. This will provide you something along those lines. Another common use case is deploying to your customers. For example, if you are deploying to customers' infrastructure. This is a really good way to kind of handle that. This is really the idea behind this, is any sort of use case or any sort of situation where you need to deploy to isolated infrastructure within the same environment. An alternative to this is I could go in and I could create different environments for each of these different tenants. That's going to work for about the first 10 or so tenants you put into the system. But as I start adding in, 50, 60, 100, 1,000 tenants on something along those lines, it's just not going to scale itself very well, because every time you add a new environment, you have to go into the project in and of itself, come in and look at the variables. Okay, what variables here are scoped to specific environments? I have these scoped to production. I have these ones scoped to development, QA, and staging. If I were to add a environment for each tenant, every single variable that has that scoping, I would then have to go through and evaluate and say, do I need to add this? Do I need to change this? In addition to that, I also have steps in my deployment process that run on specific environments. you then have to then reevaluate, should that always run on that environment or not that environment, or you have to add those environments. So it's this constant game of catch up, and that's where the tenant functionality is designed to be, where the power of it is, where I can come in here and I can say, this is my deployment process that I'm going to use, and I want to use it across all my environments and all of my tenants, but I don't have to constantly maintain everything. Tenant variables can change. That's completely understandable. Maybe a few little things that I had to tweak on the initial configuration. But after that, after this is set and ready to go, I shouldn't have to make any sort of changes. All right, let's see if this failed or not. Oh, it failed again. Named pipe, no process. Ah, dang it. Well, I'm not going to sit here and debug it. I need to make a few tweaks, apparently, and I will, whatever updates I need to make, I'll put into the notes below. So I'm just going to go ahead and fail this. So far, I've been only deploying to one tenant. I do want to show you what deploying to multiple tenants looks like, because I do think it's kind of interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new release. Let's call this 2.1.0. Make it in the release channel, because that's where I have my multiple tenants. So let me back up really quick. So I can come in here and I could say I want to select all three of these tenants manually. Or if I come over here, I can go ahead and I can select 2.1.0. Let's say I want to group this by channel so I can see what I'm doing. And I can come in here and I can click on deploy all. And then it will automatically select all of those tenants for me, which is great. I can see all the steps that it's going to run. And I can select when I want this to deploy. Now, the interesting thing about tenants is that each tenanted deployment is a separate task in a task log. So these are treated as three completely separate deployments. So if I were to come into here, I would see that I have three separate deployments running at this particular point in time. They're all going to fail. Whoops. Oh, I forgot to publish the runbook. I wonder if I can catch myself. Let's see if we can catch that really quick. I knew I forgot something. Publish. Okay. Let's just make sure that everything is kept up to date, because I think that's what I forgot to do. I forgot to publish the runbook to take advantage of the new variables. I knew I was forgetting something. But as we can see here, every single one of these releases, it's treated as a completely separate deployment. And so what you could do is you could have a situation where you kind of have a rolling set of deployments. So let's say I want to go to the Xarban branch first, an internal branch first. And in the next episode, we're going to walk through how to group tenants together, have a little bit more customization. But really, I wanted to show you what this kind of looks like on something like this. So I'm very curious if this is going to work. In addition, we're going to see 3 runbooks get triggered as well. All right, it created the database. Trident staging int. Yes, that's what I wanted to see. All right, I'll see if it actually proceeds on something like this. Acquire the packages. Fingers crossed on this. I'm genuinely curious to see how well this is going to work. But yeah, so the multi-tenancy feature is one of those more advanced features of Octopus Deploy, and it's been one of those things that I've been holding off bringing up because I wanted to cover all the different things that we have out there already. But once you start using it, you're going to start seeing a lot of use cases for it that you didn't see before. I mentioned the retail locations like we already have. If you're deploying to your customer's infrastructure and you need to have isolated infrastructure, deploying to different cloud regions that are out there, such as like AWS's regions or GCP's or Azure's. Another use case that I've seen in the wild is also each team has a tenant, which is very powerful because then you could have a test or QA environment, but then you would have a unique team or a unique person per as assigned to a tenant, and so you can kind of control when you get certain releases and everything along those lines. So again, it is one of those very powerful features that's out there, and you can get a lot of use out of it. But I am very yeah, it got all the way down there. So let's go ahead and assign this to me, and I'm going to go ahead and proceed. So as you can see, everything is working as I expected it to work. I might have to make a few tweaks, and this might be something that's very common. If you have a deployment process that's been working for quite some time and then you make multi-tenantize, you can have a few tweaks as you're learning and as you're making a few things in here. That calculate deployment mode I'm really curious about. I don't think it supports multi-tenancy. I might have to update that in the future. But yeah, this has been a rather longer episode, but multi-tenancy is one of the more complex features. In the next episode, I'm going to walk through how to organize your tenants, as well as have some custom steps that apply to specific tenants, because that is a very, very common use case, especially if you're deploying to customer infrastructure or you have unique infrastructure per retail location or per franchise or per customer or anything along those lines. But until then, until next time, thank you very much for watching and have a great rest of your day.